Hello, it's the week beginning Monday the 1st of March, and this is Business Unwrapped, a series of bonus podcasts brought to you by Tech UK and the China-British Business Council. Over the next 3 weeks, we'll be exploring the cultural, legal and ethical questions for British companies doing business with China. And today we're turning our attention to China's culture and customs. Tech companies working in China can learn more at the UK government's new website, gov.uk/digital and tech China. I'm Olly Mann, and this is Business Unwrapped. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kari Wilkin. Hi, Kari.
Hi, Ollie.
And our special guest today, Tom Simpson of the China-Britain Business Council. The CBBC, Tom. Now, most British people my age hear that acronym and think of the broom cupboard. Not the case.
Not the case, no. We're also around with the same acronym, but China-Britain Business Council. So CBBC, we've been around since the early 1950s, and since then we've evolved to what we are today, which is an organisation with offices across the UK and China. We've actually got offices in China, in 10 cities across China.
And obviously, the first we heard of COVID-19 was from Wuhan, so I imagine that the pandemic has really coloured what you do.
Well, it's completely, certainly for the first 6 months of last year, it completely shifted everything that we were, the way that we normally work. Obviously, there were no trade delegations going either way from China to the UK, and we're usually, on average, 2 or 3 a week. So it's going either way. And so that was all obviously much quieter. And we shifted our operations. We had to do a lot more online. So a lot of our events became webinars and delivered digitally. But also there was the pandemic response work as well. So we were involved in helping with the procurement efforts for the NHS. We, at the point when the pandemic was particularly severe in UK. But then before that, we were helping with procurement from the UK to help support China in the earlier stages of the pandemic. So we certainly had to adapt quite considerably during the first half of last year, and it's still ongoing, of course.
And it's all shifted online, I guess, as we are today. And Kari, we're going to be talking about culture and customs, but I have, as is the tradition here, tasked you with finding a news story to bring to the table to kick us off. So what have you got for us?
I'm asking how Boris Johnson can avoid acting like a bull in a china shop.
Socializing can be very challenging, especially under the content of business. Therefore, I've chosen 12 essential Chinese business phrases for you to make the most of your socializing experience. Let's go. 很高兴能跟您会面. 很高兴能跟您会面. Very happy to meet you.
A small taster of the video, Essential Phrases to Speak Professional Business Chinese in a Social Setting. Catchy and precise. You can discover the whole thing on the Dig Mandarin YouTube channel. Tom, I'm sure, understood every word. Kari, what's the story?
Okay, so post-Brexit Britain is looking to make and strengthen international trade ties, and an increasing number of UK companies are trying to navigate the complexities of doing business in China, because this is a huge market and there can be huge rewards if you can crack it. And obviously that's something that Boris Johnson recognises. There have been recent reports that during a Downing Street roundtable with Chinese firms in mid-February, the Prime Minister said he was fervently Sinophile and determined to improve ties, quote, whatever the occasional political difficulties. So there's a real push, certainly from within Number 10, to strengthen these trade ties with China. But the point I was making with my somewhat cryptic intro was that China has a very different working culture, and that's something obviously that businesses and prime ministers need to be aware of.
And also, Kari, I mean, it's one thing to sort of drop hints of your intentions, but the fact is, amidst the alleged genocide of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, ministers have repeatedly promised the House of Lords there are going to be no imminent new deals with China.
Yeah, I think it's worth emphasising that this meeting was behind closed doors, this reported meeting. So, Boris Johnson, he has to keep his options open, doesn't he, basically? And the challenge facing him is that London needs to be able to challenge Beijing about human rights issues without tipping into a trade war. And, and also not offending other potential trade partners. The US has criticised the EU for pressing ahead in December with with an investment deal in China. So he's having to tread a very fine line. But what he's really suggesting is that the UK resumes formal trade talks with China by reactivating 2 forums that were suspended in response to China's response to civil rights crackdown in Hong Kong. So he's not necessarily saying, these deals are going to happen now, but he's certainly trying to leave the gate open to that happening in the future once these human rights issues have been sorted or resolved.
Tom, what's the response been in China to Boris Johnson's comments?
Well, I think it's sort of welcome news in the sense that, there hasn't been much positivity come out of the sort of UK-China political sphere in some time. I know that the news went down well with Chinese people who are sort of, they generally see the UK as being a friend, and sentiment from China towards the UK is generally quite positive. Although, maybe the same can't be said for the UK towards China in the last year or so. So positive, it was welcome, warmly welcomed. And I think, from the business community here, there have been, repeated calls for the UK to get a JETCO and EFD in place, which is the 2 meetings that you mentioned. So it's positive, to hear that these are now being discussed at number 10.
And has their suspension because of those concerns about Hong Kong, has that had an impact on Chinese-British business?
It slows things down to some extent because, where companies are trying to press for, say, market access or press for, acquiring new licenses to operate, new businesses here, JETCO and EFDs is a great opportunity for companies to press those points forward. And so we haven't had those channels, to work with in the last, well over a year. It goes back longer than actually before the pandemic. So, with the EU signing the comprehensive agreement on investment, EU companies now, and obviously the UK has left the EU, European companies, and particularly those from Germany and France, will be going around with the CAI agreements, and I'm sure are speaking to their counterparts at Chinese regulators saying, okay, we've got this agreement, can we get the access that we're talking about? Obviously the agreement isn't yet in place, and it's a provisional agreement, the CAI, but even so, European companies can still refer to it when they're speaking to counterparts here. Within the Chinese government.
Okay, so let's leave behind some of these, complicated acronyms and legislatures that may or may not be unsuspended, and talk about setting up your business in China. So if you run a business here in Britain and you are thinking of setting up in China, possibly because of Brexit is a reason, isn't it? Tom's the expert here, so I'll come to him second. Kari, what have you learned from researching around that surprised you about the way the Chinese do things?
Having lived in Japan for a year, I had a personal experience of just how different Eastern culture can be to Western culture and how easy it is to offend people without meaning to. For example, like China, Japan is a very hierarchical system. And, and I was aware that I was constantly just not understanding the nuances of status in business meetings. And, and I think the hosts were very forgiving of that. But at the same time, it does make it that much harder to make ties. And, just little things, and I understand it's the same in China, that negative answers are considered very impolite. So, for example, if rather than saying a blunt no, it will be, people say, I'll think about it, or maybe. But as a Westerner coming into that, I kept going to my boss and going, well, have you made a decision about this? And he kept saying maybe. And I'm going, and he's telling me no, but I'm not hearing him. So there are so many different nuances that you really need help from within Chinese culture, if as a foreign business, to understand how to behave in a way that's not going to offend people.
Yeah, that culture clash has been the source of a lot of now very outdated sort of sitcoms in this country, hasn't it, Tom? You can sort of imagine, the bowing and the music and everything as British delegations meet Chinese delegations in comedy shows. But it's based on a truth, which is that the two nations are very different in the way that they approach negotiations. You don't want to come across as overly hostile. There are different acceptances of politeness. What's the biggest trap that people fall into on that very basic kind of human level?
Well, I suppose one of the mistakes that people make is perhaps sometimes they can overplay the importance of the cultural differences, especially in this day and age where, especially if you're dealing with sort of, say, private Chinese businesses in, tier 1 cities where often the people you're working with have lived overseas and are quite sort of international, and perhaps being too sort of delicate and sensitive around, how to manage that relationship. And when in actual fact, you should say, let's go get a beer, watch some football or whatever, and approach the relationship much like you would anyone in Europe. But that's not to say that, of course, particularly in the state-owned sector, or if you're dealing with companies who are perhaps in sort of second and third tier cities or outside of, the main sort of urban East Coast, then perhaps, you need to go back to a bit more of the sort of traditional way of doing business in China, where, things like gifts are appreciated. And, if you bring a bottle of gin from your hometown, it always goes down well, or things like this. So.
But there's even traditions, aren't there, with giving gifts that you have to give it with both hands rather than one hand, or otherwise it looks... I know traditionally that's the system, that it looks very offhand and almost rude to just give it with one hand. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and that applies to the business card as well. So, I've been in meeting rooms in the UK where someone threw their business card at me across a business meeting room table, and I was just incredibly offended because I'm used to people handing them to me with two hands. And then also, as you say, with gifts as well, it's a similar sort of thing. It's a sort of mark of respect. So,
how do you judge what gift is the right gift, though? Because again, to Western eyes, that can look like a corruption, can't it? Give them a gift kind of suggests like a kind of mafia thing. Give the guy a tip.
The sort of gift giving in China is, these days it's you want to give a very low key gift, so it's something that's more meaningful than necessarily monetary value. So as I say, so something that's from your hometown, or like a biscuit brand that's particularly popular in your hometown, or like your local gin distillery or something. And certainly with government officials, you don't want to be handing over an expensive bottle of whiskey or something.
And on the kind of more macro level, what do businesses get wrong when they go there from a customs point of view? What's different about the way things are set up that perhaps British businesses really just don't appreciate when they go over to China?
Well, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that it's not possible to wholly own a business in China as a foreign company. You can you can set up what's called a WOFE, which is a wholly owned foreign enterprise. Also repatriating profits. So it is possible to transact money from your revenues, from earnings. Those are probably the two big ones when it comes to sort of setting up and running a business here.
But there are issues around those things, aren't there? For example, with data ownership. And I guess it's knowing what is problematic, what data of yours is going to end up effectively, being managed by the Chinese state, and what can remain private. I mean, how do you navigate all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, this is a particularly big issue at the moment, and it's certainly front and center on the minds of British companies who are operating here, especially the multinationals who've got very complex sort of data management systems. It's not impossible to work your way through these sorts of issues. And if you look at companies like Apple, they've managed to find solutions, or Steam, Valve, the online PC games platform have found solutions where, essentially, you just have to follow all the local rules and keep data that, should belong in China. And there's now sort of huge data centers here that can help and support that. But it does create a lot of headaches for companies, certainly. And those headaches aren't yet fully resolved, I would say, for business.
And even if you get the infrastructure right, Kari, there's then just a question of branding, I guess. China's a huge landmass. So what works in one region of China perhaps won't work in another. And actually, particularly what works in Europe might not work in the East at all.
Yeah, it's so hard to grasp just the full size of China. It's got a total population of 1.4 billion people. That's about a fifth of the world's population. And just to try and get some sense of the numbers, there's more than 100 cities with populations of more than 1 million people. So to try and just sort of make some sweeping assumption about the Chinese market, let alone making the distinction from the European, or the Western markets, a lot of companies have fallen down because they just failed to recognise these differences. Major companies we're talking about, including, the likes of Amazon and eBay. And when you look at the success stories about the companies that have actually made it over in China, for example, LinkedIn, that entered the Chinese market in 2014 and now has more than 20 million Chinese users. Reading up on it, it sounds like what LinkedIn did right, it was that it adapted to the Chinese market by listening to the government's restrictions on content and LinkedIn stored Chinese data in local services to let the government access that as well, which led to an easing of red tape, whatever you think about, sort of the ethical issues around it. But also they partnered with local investment firms and relied on their experience to get to grips with the market. They hired a Chinese person to be president of the company and allowed the Chinese team to basically adapt the platform to suit the Chinese market. And as a result, it's really paid off for LinkedIn. Yeah,
I mean, on a very basic level, Tom, is it wise, however big your company is, even if you're as big as LinkedIn, to be thinking of your Chinese operations as sort of a franchise, which are a cooperation between you and the Chinese?
Exactly. I think, there's lots of examples of companies, multinationals, who are taking that sort of strategic approach. and sort of China for China. Their China business is essentially, isolated from the rest of its operation. And I think LinkedIn is a great example, and Apple as well, as I mentioned, is another one. But you're also now starting to see it with the car makers too. So the likes of Volkswagen and others who very significant market share in China. They're looking at ways with which they can have essentially a Volkswagen China business, and that focuses on the needs and wants of customers here, but also the supply chains are sort of localized as well.
Okay, I mean, we have some very illustrious listeners. It might well be that there are people who work for Apple and Volkswagen listening to this, but let's imagine that actually we're talking about a small and medium enterprise here, and you want to have a Chinese base. For a start, there's recruitment. How do you find those partners to work with? What's the best way in?
Well, organizations like the CBBC are a great place to start. We actually provide a market entry service, which we call Launchpad, where we can employ a Chinese national on behalf of a UK business and base them in our office. We provide all the sort of physical, desk and so forth, but then do all the back end management for that individual. A lot of companies use that service very successfully. We currently have 75 clients who are using that service. But that's a good way if people want to have sort of one or two people in country on the ground. Obviously, to get to that point, you want to have a bit of traction with your business. So finding partners, certainly if you're in the consumer business, then you want to be looking at finding distribution partners and so forth. And with distributors, particularly in the consumer sector, you don't want to necessarily keep yourself stuck to just one distributor, because China is a big country. If you're doing distribution across Europe, you probably wouldn't look at working with just one company to do the entire thing. In China, often companies find that you want a distributor that does Guangdong very well, in the South China, which is a very significant market, and then East China, North, West. So yeah, you want to be looking at finding multiple partners in that case. But then, like with any sort of due diligence on finding partners, you need to do your homework. You need to make sure the companies you're speaking to are who they say they are, and you can do company checks. And just like you can in the UK with Companies House, there's the AIC in China. You can do these checks these days online. Obviously, it's all in Chinese, but if you can get someone to help you with that, then great. And again, we do that sort of stuff.
Yeah, an interpreter seems like a good first step.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, for small, medium-sized companies, one method that we often hear companies using successfully, and one that we actually encourage, is to employ Chinese students in the UK, so either as interns or take them on full-time after they finish the studies in the UK, so they can work for your business, get to know you in the UK, understand what it is you're doing, and then they can work for you in China and help you to sort of, I suppose, become more familiar with Chinese business culture and the way of doing things, and get WeChat set up on all your employee phones and things like this.
So maybe one of the ways, Kari, to see whether Boris Johnson really is serious about what he says is to see how many Chinese students they have working for them in the Cabinet Office.
Or whether he has a WeChat account or not.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Not known for his tact in dealing with foreign cultures, is he, Boris? Talking about the translators, I think you also need to make sure you've got a really good translator when you're translating slogans. I was reading up about some of the mistranslated slogans, and they're hysterical. Pepsi, for example, tried to translate the slogan "Pepsi brings you back to life," as in gives you pep, for the Chinese market, and that ended up as "Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead." The KFC slogan "Finger looking good" became "Eat your fingers off." So obviously there are so many potential pitfalls unless you really get good people to help you.
What about managing staff when you get them, Tom, in a culturally sensitive way? What are the pitfalls there?
Well, I think this is where the sort of concept of face kind of comes in the sense of, managing staff. And if you, say, for example, if you have staff who are perhaps in their 50s, then you may have to manage them differently from millennial staff or Gen Z staff, because the generation divide here is quite significant, much more so than I'd say it is in the UK. So you have to be conscious of that. I think young people here, if they join your company, they want to be well looked after. They perhaps have more sort of demands and expectations in terms of the office environment. They want an office environment that is pleasant to work in and has a bit of prestige. If you're a foreign business operating here and you've got, say, foreign nationals in your office in China working together with Chinese nationals, you have to find this kind of middle ground where you localize, but you're still a business that's from the UK. So you've still got, and actually often, local staff who join your company want to join your company because you are from the UK, and perhaps they've got a passion for British culture, perhaps they've got passion for the English language, and they see working for your business as a way to both make a salary, learn about the trade that your business operates in, but also have a closer connection with the UK or the country that your business is from.
Finally, I'm interested in what you said about millennials there, because it seems to me that a lot of the businesses that Britain can offer, AI, big data, fintech, e-commerce, are things where you're going to be employing a lot of millennials and Gen Z staff. So what's different about a Chinese millennial to a European millennial, do you think?
Well, they use completely different social media platforms, that's for certain. So in China, the likes of ByteDance and Douyin are immensely popular here, and Kuaishou as well, sort of the short form video apps. I'm only on WeChat. I'm a bit of a granddad when it comes to social media in China, but a lot of my colleagues are certainly on these. But things like live stream sales is huge in China, and Douyin is at the sort of forefront of that, and also sort of Taobao Live and things like that. And we've done a little bit of that with CBBC, which is quite fun. So like QVC, but for millennials, basically. The big differences are, I suppose, that millennials in the UK, people like to. There's a different way of socializing. Here, people like to socialize in, more sort of go for a nice dinner and maybe go do some KTV, but there's usually a little bit of alcohol involved, not too much. Whereas in the UK, people like to have a good drink, go out clubbing, things like that.
Do some KTV. What is that, karaoke?
KTV, sorry, karaoke, yeah.
Yeah, you see, now I thought of that as a Japanese thing, Kari, but obviously it's a Chinese thing too. Did you?
Yeah, it's huge here.
Oh, the hours I spent in karaoke bars, it's great fun.
What was your song of choice? What was your big number?
It was Walk Like an Egyptian for some reason. I did the dance with it as well. You had to be there.
What a showstopper. What an image for us to end on. Thank you very much for joining me, Tom Simpson and Kari Wilkin. This series of Business Unwrapped is brought to you by Tech UK and the China British Business Council. For more information about the opportunities and challenges of working in China, do visit china.theweek.co.uk. And for the latest UK government advice, gov.uk/digital and tech China. Next week, here on Business Unwrapped, we'll talk about the Chinese legal system, from market access rules and regulations to intellectual property rights. How can you prepare your business to work under Chinese law? And what do you do when things go wrong? And remember, each Friday I host The Week Unwrapped, 3 under-the-radar news stories digested and debated by our team. To get that, just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice and press subscribe. And these bonus episodes will drop into your feed as well. I've been Olly Mann. The music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until next time, bye-bye.